Let's begin by reading from verse 17 through 22. Actually, just for good measure, let's start reading from 9, since 8, since that's a section that really starts with the discussion of Abraham. We won't really go back and discuss that except sort of tertiarily, but let's read it again for the sake of completeness. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was to go. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received what was promised, but having seen it and greeted it from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your descendants be named." He considered that God was able to raise men even from the dead. Hence he did receive him back, and this was a symbol. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his burial. And so we begin with the sacrifice of Isaac. Let's read about the sacrifice of Isaac from Genesis. It's chapter 22, starting in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "Take your son, your only begotten son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here am I, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Then Abraham put forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only begotten son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only begotten son, I will indeed bless you, and I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gates of their enemies. And by your descendants shall all the nations of the earth bless themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men. And they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. So has the author changed anything? Has he subtracted anything?
Well, he added the part about raising up the dead.
Right. That's an addition.
Yeah.
Is there any subtraction?
Well, he doesn't put in the part that God told him to do the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Your only love, there you shall offer him as a holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
Was certainly
Right.
foretold of what Jesus, that God was going to do the same with his only son.
So he's left out the whom you love.
Yeah.
So he's removed the element of Abraham loving his son. Why does he do that? So in Genesis, the issue really is an issue of love for his son versus obedience to God.
Mm.
But the author doesn't draw on, doesn't emphasize love for son
He emphasizes the obedience to God.
versus the promise.
Yeah.
He emphasizes command versus promise.
Mm-hmm.
We have the addition of raising from the dead. It says that he considered that God was able to raise men even from the dead. The considered is probably kind of a weaker translation. He calculated is probably a better one. That he was certain. It denotes a certainty and not merely a considered opinion. It's also in the past tense, which suggests that the conclusion was reached and firmly held, at once. So as this was unfolding, there was no wavering on Abraham's part. So why would he think that God would raise Isaac from the dead?
Well, I thought that God made a promise to Abraham that he was going to have more descendants than the stars in heaven or the sands on the beach. And if his only begotten son was sacrificed, where would they come from? So maybe he made the connection that, you know, God is all powerful, so he could rise them from the dead. I don't know if they call it resurrection back then too, like just rising his son up from the dead and able to fulfill the promise he made to Abraham.
But why would he think that?
Why would he think it? You mean if he's going to kill his son, then he would have no heirs, right?
Right. So it's a dilemma, but how do you get to raising him from the dead?
Well, he knows God is powerful, that he could do that. He could raise his son from the dead. So he wouldn't forsaken Abraham. He would.
But what is the basis? What is the basis for thinking that he would raise him from the dead?
Well, if they thought that with God everything's possible, because he'd given them manna from the heavens and the commandments, and
I see that smile, Ron. What are we missing?
Well, no, it's just that, you know, raising someone from the dead doesn't, you know, kind of naturally occur to you.
no.
And, you know, so remember, this is Abraham, so this is early. There are no precedents, you know, so
Yeah.
Elijah raised someone from the dead, Elisha, but, you know, it's rare. Jesus, you know, did it most commonly, but, you know, that kind of example doesn't exist because this is Abraham and it's in Genesis. So
Would his thought on raising from the dead be just called a miracle? Just that he would think that a miracle could be performed by God, and the miracle would be raising him from the dead, because if he kills them, he has to do something to get him back. It wouldn't be that he wouldn't figure that out. I don't know. Maybe too simple.
maybe, but um, but we do have something of a precedence.
Oh, okay.
Don't
You
we?
know it. Share it.
Well, go back a little bit. Go back to the previous section.
Okay.
What, in Hebrews?
Mhm.
Okay.
Or two sections ago, in verse 30, in verse 12.
Mhm.
Therefore, from one man, and so remember, they laughed, or Sarah laughed at the notion that she was going to have a son,
Yeah.
right? And Abraham himself was not exactly, didn't appear to be a strong believer. And in fact, he was such a not strong believer that he, you know, went and had Ishmael through Hagar. So the author of Hebrews says, therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the sea. So Abraham is as good as dead, and yet God has performed a resurrection to produce Isaac. So resurrection is possible. God can resurrect the dead as he's resurrected Abraham and Sarah. So this comes from Chrysostom, by the way. This is Chrysostom's analysis.
I was just thinking that because of that miracle, Abraham could see that that miraculous things could be done. But you know, I never made the connection that he was as good as dead because he was so old.
Yeah.
That that was even more than the miracle. Just he brought him back to be alive to reproduce. So I see the connection. Gosh, that was so just in front of our eyes, and I didn't see that, but I knew it had a connection there.
So there are a couple of sort of interesting things that sort of sustain the author's argument if we go back to the account in Genesis. So notice first of all that Abraham tells the two young men who accompany him that they will return. He says, stay in verse 20, chapter 22, verse 5. He says, stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. So he expects, unless he's lying, he expects that everyone is coming back. Then Isaac asks, where is the lamb to be burnt?
Yeah.
And he doesn't say that it's not a lamb, it's you who are going to turn into charcoal.
Yeah, that must have been frightening.
But also, instead of that, so Isaac asks, where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.
Mm-hmm.
So he's saying that God will provide a lamb, but also in terms of that later passage where he says, hence he did receive him back, and this was a symbol. Abraham answers, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And so the expression in Hebrew is ambiguous. So the question is, what does himself modify? So one version, one possible translation, or one possible understanding, not so much translation, but one possible understanding of the sentence in the original Hebrew is that God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering. So God will come up with the lamb just as he does. But the second interpretation or understanding is that God will provide himself as the lamb for the burnt offering. And then that points forward to the cross and the resurrection of Christ. And so in verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. So offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, and then whatever. So we have the verb to offer up twice. It's a verb used in the context of sacrifice. To offer up is a sacrifice. And the interesting thing is that the tense is different. In the first offered up is in the perfect tense. It's an action completed. So from Abraham's point of view, he brought Isaac, laid him down on the wood. He had completed his part of the sacrifice. The first part is perfect. Second part is past imperfect, which is to say that the action was begun and not completed. So from Abraham's point of view, he completed his part of the sacrifice. He brought the offering. And
Going
God,
through with the slaughter wouldn't be part of his role? Or just bringing it would be enough?
Well,
He tied him up and he was going to
so, in some
sacrifice.
ways, I mean, in terms of sacrificially, the offering of the thing to be offered is, conceptually separate from its consumption. And so, when you bring an animal to the temple, you don't slaughter it yourself. You give it to the priest. And so your assumption has to, your responsibility as a worshiper who is obedient to the law is that you bring the animal. Then once the animal is brought, it's out of your control. Yeah. And so the priest sacrifices it, but you don't really know that. You only know that you brought the animal and turned it over, and you hope that the priest has sacrificed it, and often in terms of, we read Malachi, the prophets, that's not necessarily the case, but nevertheless, your responsibility as a worshiper is over. So I think he has that in view, that Abraham, did his part. He brought Isaac. He placed Isaac in God's hands, and God stopped the sacrifice. So, given that the sacrifice of Isaac becomes a symbol of the cross and resurrection, except that there's an argument which may be correct. I'm actually not certain, but that wasn't understood as the author's intent until the 2nd century. And so we have, about a century in which there's no clear evidence that anyone understood this as being evidence of the resurrection, and that instead it was thought to be, within the context of Jewish Christianity, a reference to the second benediction. So among diaspora Jews, there were 18 benedictions. They're sort of similar to the divine praises. So blessed be God, blessed be his holy name. But also, what else does it point forward to? So the cross and the resurrection, passion of Christ. Is there anything else the author has mentioned? In chapter 10, verse 25, he's talking about stirring up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet, all the more as you see the day drawing near. The day is the day of resurrection, the day of the second coming, the day of the Lord. Isaac is a symbol also of the general resurrection of the dead. Then for his audience, it's a symbol that it's a call to renew the faith of those who have apathy, renew the faith in the God who can raise, has the power to raise the dead. Partly within its own context, and also implicitly within the author's use of it. Are there any other conclusions to be drawn from it? So set within the context of a monotheistic culture, or an emerging monotheistic culture against the backdrop of polytheistic
Mhm.
religions, what would the significance of the story be? So why might it be here?
So Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob and Esau.
Mm-hmm.
And then Joseph was one of
One of the
12.
12.
Yeah. So certainly is, they are multiplying.
Mm-hmm. Like rabbits.
Yeah.
Well, one of the significance of the story in its original context. So polytheistic religions, you sacrifice stuff, including humans.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens, particularly in periods of famine and drought and whatever, periods of extreme hardship, is you sacrifice your children. And so part of the point of the story is that God does not accept human sacrifice. Yahweh does not accept human sacrifice. And then for the author, there's an implicit message here that that allegiance to God extends even beyond the most intimate of family ties. Allegiance to God is primary, and it's really supplant is the wrong word, but it is more important than any other tie. And in fact, it defines, and I mean, the reality is it defines and enriches other ties, and provides them with meaning, and also allows us to endure in times when those family ties are very strained. Two final comments on the symbol and Isaac getting him back. Theodoret of Syr, who was a 4th century father, wrote, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back, that is, by way of symbol and type of the resurrection. Put to death by his father's zeal, he came back to life at the word of the one who prevented the slaughter. In him, the type of the saving passion was also prefigured. Hence, the Lord also said to the Jews, your father Abraham rejoiced at the prospect of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. So, in the saving of Isaac, Abraham rejoiced at the prospect of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. He saw a foretaste of the resurrection. And St. Augustine saw the ram in the thicket as a symbol of Christ in the crown of thorns, the thicket being the crown of thorns, a symbol of the crown of thorns. But then we have the 3 patriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We have the blessing of Jacob and the prophecy over Esau. We have um, the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, and we have Joseph and his mention of the Exodus and his burial. Is there anything that seems unusual? Is there anything that seems to be kind of missing or overlooked or um, unexpected about that in those 3 things? Maybe something that you're not familiar with, but isn't it striking that Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, but the blessing of his own sons, which you would expect and is, far better known, would appear. So Jacob blesses his own sons in Genesis chapter 49. And Jacob's blessing of his sons is far better known than the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, and was far better known. So why does he do that? The author, I mean, why does he do the blessing of Joseph's sons and not the blessing of his own sons? Possibly we get a hint if we just start reading the first. I guess I would say they're more prophetic than blessing, but Genesis chapter 49, verse 3, which is his prophetic word about Reuben, is Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the first fruits of my strength. Preeminent in pride and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. You went up to my couch. So, any idea of why he's instead done the sons of Joseph?
So generally, it's the firstborn that's blessed, right?
Right.
The king killed Abel.
Right. So we have, right. So
Got a twist.
that's one issue. We have Isaac technically isn't the firstborn.
Right.
Ishmael is. Matrilineal descent doesn't really matter in Judaism. It's patrilineal descent. So Isaac is the secondborn. Jacob stole the blessing, so he's the secondborn. And Joseph is the last.
Yeah.
The youngest. So that's one thing, but is there anything else? So these are all people who are at the point of, providing the blessing, are about to die. So they're looking beyond their deaths to the promise, which they know is real. The promise is very objective to them. And so, they're speaking about and they're blessing based on the knowledge that the promise will be fulfilled. And in fact, so that's in fact clearest in Jacob's blessing of Joseph's sons, of Ephraim and Manasseh. So on the one hand, blessing children before death is sort of a solemn Jewish practice where, you sort of bless children for the gifts that God has given them. But here the gift is promise and hope, which is sort of somewhat unusual. And so, there's a certainty that their death will not defeat God's promises or will not defeat God's purposes, that God's purpose will be fulfilled. So let's look at Isaac's blessing of Jacob and Esau, which are somewhat scandalous. It's Genesis chapter 27. So Isaac is old. He asks Esau to go hunting and to make a stew for him, to bring it to him, and then he'll bless him. And Rebecca overhears this, and she makes stew and gives it to Isaac, and also dresses up. So Esau is hairy and Isaac is not. And so she dresses up Isaac in Esau's clothing and gives him something to make his arms and whatever seem hairy. And then, so in verse 18, so he is Isaac, went into his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that you may bless me." But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. He said, "Are you really my son, Esau?" He answered, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac, his father, Esau, his brother, came in from his hunting. He also prepared savory food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" He answered, "I am your son, your firstborn, Esau." Then Isaac trembled violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and he shall be blessed." When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." But he said, "Your brother came with guile, and he has taken away your blessing." Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Then he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Then in verse 39, then Isaac his father answered him, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck." So notice that it says that Jacob answered. It's not really a blessing. It's rather more of a prophetic word. that really doesn't have blessing in it. So Jacob receives the blessing. Couldn't the author have mentioned that Jacob received the blessing through deceit?
Yeah.
Why did he leave that out? Well, one of the reasons, which is the same as Thais pointed out about Abraham and his sort of shortcomings, is that everybody would have known about this. Everybody would have known that Jacob stole the blessing. Anyone who steeped in the Old Testament would know it. But why else?
But instead of him like saying like, like he wants to emphasize maybe the blessing itself instead of how they got there,
Mhm.
like what the
Right.
blessed means, and what the promise is instead of how they got there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. His focus is on faith. His focus is on eschatological fulfillment, that the promises of God will be fulfilled. And but also in addition to that, you'll notice that in the original chapter in Genesis, when Isaac discovers that he gave the wrong son the blessing, it says that then Isaac trembled violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game?" Then Esau asked to be blessed, and he said, "Your brother came with guile, and he has taken away your blessing." Then Esau says, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Isaac says, "Behold, I have made him your lord, and all his brothers I have given to him for servants. What then can I do for you?" So Isaac when he trembles, he recognizes that somehow, although guile was used, God's purpose was served by the blessing to Jacob and not to Esau. And so he recognizes that that is the working out of God's plan. The final thing I think about this is that my translation says, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. The literal translation is Isaac blessed even with respect to their future. And so there's no article. It's not the future, it's future. So it points to a future as yet unseen. And even is intensive, so it focuses on the unseen future. We have Jacob's blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. So really the same thing happens there, that Jacob is displeased, or Joseph rather is displeased that Jacob reverses hands. So he puts his right hand on the hand of Ephraim, the younger son, and left on the hand of Manasseh, the older son. And Joseph tries to reverse them, but Isaac refuses. Jacob rather refuses. He's done it deliberately. So here again, we have a focus on the future. But what's also interesting about this being Jacob is that in the Jewish tradition, Jacob is not seen as being particularly a person of faith. It's being seen mostly as sort of a trickster who seeks God's blessing. But the author instead sees him as a person of faith. And here he, sees you by focusing on this section, he clearly sees him as being very prophetic and a person of faith. And then says, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. The bowing in worship over the head of his staff is actually done earlier. It's done in chapter 47 of Genesis. So Jacob calls Joseph and says in verse 29, chapter 47, now I have found favor in your sight. Put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal loyally and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So he moves that to be part of the blessing. But also in the Septuagint, it's staff. In the Masoretic text, it's bed. The staff emphasizes the theme of people of God as sojourners. The staff is for Hebrews the sign of pilgrimage. And then finally, we have Joseph's mention of Exodus and burial. That comes from Genesis chapter 50, starting in 24. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and will bring you up out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath of the sons of Israel, saying, God will visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here. So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So his desire is to be buried in Canaan, although he's 110 years old, so he's lived 93 years in Egypt. He came to Egypt when he was sold into slavery and was 17 years old. So that's evidence of trust that God would would fulfill his promises and would return his people to Canaan. Then in Exodus chapter 13, Moses takes his body on the Exodus, and then Joshua in chapter 24 of Joshua takes it into the promised land, into Canaan. The Hebrews, the author says that by faith, Joseph at the end of his life made mention of the exodus of the Israelites. Made mention is not in my translation anyway, is not a good translation. It's that he remembered the Exodus. But the Exodus is 400 years in the future. How can that be?
Well, God had already foretold the Exodus to Abraham.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. So in chapter 15, verses 13 and 14, the Lord said to Abraham, know of a surety that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be slaves there and they will be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation which they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. So, promise of the Exodus to Abraham was so reliable that to Joseph it was as if it had already occurred. So, a testimony to his faith that he was so certain of God's promises that it was as if that he remembered them as if they had already occurred, even though they were 4 centuries in the future. And with that, we're virtually out of time. And I think we've finished the section.